Hi everyone, Christina Werner here. Welcome to another video for Assignment Stamp. Today I'm going to be showing you 3 different ways to use masking tape to create watercolor patterns. I'm going to be using 3 different kinds of watercolor today. One is watercolor markers. I'm using Karin markers. The other is pearlescent paints from Finetec. And then the third is some watercolors from American Crafts. This is the Paper Fashion watercolor set, and there are 12 colors in this particular pan set, and I've really enjoyed them as I've been using them over the last few months. Because I'm going to be showing you 3 different kinds of patterns with masking tape, I'm going to cut down some Arches watercolor paper to some smaller pieces. So I've just taken this 9 by 12 sheet and cut it into quarters, and I'm going to use 3 of them. I'm going to have very narrow strips of masking tape to create my patterns. And because this masking tape is just shy of 1 inch wide, I'm going to cut it down. I'm using my grid mat here. This is an Altenew grid mat. And I'm just lining up these strips of tape along the inch mark lines on my grid mat. I'm using this mat in particular because one, there's a grid on it, so it gives me a guide where I can line up my ruler at the top and bottom and make sure I get a straight cut, but also because it's a self-healing mat so that I'm not cutting into anything or ruining my desktop here. So if you have a grid mat like this is a great time to break it out. If you don't, you can kind of make do with what you have. In a pinch, you could even put these strips of tape onto some sort of slick surface, maybe like a laminated piece of packaging or something like that, and then cut into that and peel up the tape strips. I'm lining up my watercolor paper on my grid mat, and then I'm going to use the lines above and below that watercolor paper to guide me as I put on these strips of tape. So we did want to mention that the first 3 strips of tape of each width that I've cut, they're all 1/4 inch. But the 4th little segment is a little bit more narrow. That's because the tape, like I said earlier, is just shy of 1 inch wide. So I'm going to be skipping that 4th strip of tape, and I'll reserve that for the next pattern. After I had these lines put down onto my watercolor paper, I pressed them down very firmly, and then I'm going to set that aside. My second pattern is very, very simple as well. In fact, I'm only going to be doing 2 vertical strips, and I'm going to use that narrow strip that I mentioned earlier that was left over from my first piece of tape, lining that up, and then I'm going to grab another narrow strip from the next kind of width of tape that I cut apart, and I'll put down the other side. And these aren't exactly even on the watercolor paper, but when I cut it down eventually after I've painted, it will look more even. For this third pattern, this one's a little bit more involved, but still very simple. I did some horizontal stripes, and I made sure that each one of these was exactly 1 1/4 inch apart. So 5 of the little grid squares on my grid mat. After I had all of those on, then I just added a diagonal one, just anywhere. Doesn't really matter exactly where. And after I have that on, I lifted up my piece and I rotated it, and I lined up that new line with my grid mat. You can see that it's lined up on both sides, on the left and right. And now I'm going to use that as my reference point to add in more of these narrow strips. So I'm putting 5 squares in between, just like I did before, and then lining that up. So now I have sort of this wonky grid with my tape on my watercolor paper. Then I turned it the other direction, and I wanted to kind of put the tape where these intersect. For the most part, they line up with the grid mark because I've tried to be pretty precise, but some of these are a little bit off. The triangles aren't the exact same size. It's not a big deal. We're just making a fun pattern today. For this very first one, just the simple stripes, I've taped it to a hardboard because I'm going to paint the entire surface area and I don't want it to warp. So I've taped it down really well, and I've pressed all of those pieces of tape onto the watercolor paper with my fingertips. I really want them to be pressed down really well so that I don't have any tape seeping underneath. I'm going to be using 2 different colors from this paint set, this kind of yellow-green shade, and then also the blue that's right next to it. I started out by diluting the green paint quite a bit so that it was very, very loose and very watery. And then I added more paint to make it thicker and intensify that color. And now I'm going to start transitioning that green shade to the blue. So I'm going to add a little bit of that blue color. It's going to turn it even more green. And I want to have it be quite different from the color before. So I'm going to make sure I add quite a bit of blue. Then painted that on, made sure I got all the way into those corners of the tape. And then I'm going to add more blue. So as I move down each section to the bottom of this watercolor panel, I'm adding more and more blue to that mixture on my palette because I want it to eventually transition completely to just that blue shade without any other colors. When I did this particular section, I started to paint it and it still wasn't quite blue enough. So I went straight into that blue pan of watercolor and then onto my project. And the residual kind of greenish paint on my brush mixed with that new paint that I added, and I got a really nice shade. For the very last section, I took the paint directly from the palette and just painted that blue shade directly on. So this was such flat color. It was beautiful. I love that transition of colors. I let that dry and I actually hit it with my heat tool to speed up the process, and then very carefully peeled up these strips of tape. In order to prevent any tearing of any masking tape taking off the top surface, you might want to bend back that tape back on itself as much as you can. That seems to help. So there's my first pattern, really simple and fun. The second pattern, I'm using some Finetec pearlescent watercolors, and I'm just going to be using, I think, 4 different shades, and I'm going to mask off the far left kind of column that I created with that first narrow strip of tape. I'm going to do diagonal lines, kind of more wide lines using each of these colors, and I'm going to change colors as I move down this column. Now, because I'm only using about 4 different colors from the palette, I am going to repeat some colors. For the most part, I don't want the same color next to a stripe of the same color. But I think on the second column when I was working here, I did repeat the gold shade. And I think that, just having one repeat is probably okay. So I hit that with my heat tool to speed up the drying process. And then I moved that piece of tape over to the other side and rotated my piecers just so I could have a little bit of an easier time painting. So I hit that with my heat tool after I added more paint, and then I'm going on to the third panel. You'll notice that I alternated the direction of these diagonal stripes, going from one column to the next. It's creating a little bit of a herringbone pattern, and it's going to look really handmade and hand painted once I remove all this tape. So I lifted up those narrow tape strips, and then you have the clean vertical lines, but the little more hand-drawn wonky lines in between the different diagonal stripes. And the shine on this and the sheen from those pearlescent paints is just beautiful. For my third pattern, I've taped it down to a hardboard, and I've also gone over it with my fingertips to make sure it's down really well. And now I'm going to be using my Karan markers. Now, I tested out a few different ways of adding these colors on, and then this was my favorite application. So I skipped ahead to just show you my favorite. I wet the entire triangle area and then used the tip of the marker to drop in color on the corners. Used a wet paintbrush to sort of spread that color out and get it to mix a little bit near the center of the triangle. And I did this with a bunch of different triangles going all the way across this pattern, changing the color all along. I think I had a few different color combinations, some yellows to red, even red to purple, just quite a few different kind of rainbow-esque color palettes or color combinations on each one of these triangles. And I did about 2 triangles at a time because that was about all I could handle while still keeping the watercolor paper very wet so the colors could move. I really love how these Karan markers mix with each other. They're very blendable and easy to work with. You could do this same technique with other types of watercolor. I would recommend wetting each triangle and then getting a very concentrated amount of paint and dropping that in the corners. That's essentially what I'm doing here with the marker because the ink coming out of the marker is very concentrated. And that's what you need in the corners so that it really wicks away and starts to spread out. So I'm continuing painting, kind of getting those colors to mix with each other. I'm trying to get as much variation in color going across and not have any triangles of the same color side by side. After I dried that, I removed all of those masking tape strips, and I'm left with this really fun triangle pattern. Now, if you want to do a similar painting technique, you don't want to do it with the masking tape, I have a recommendation for a background stamp for you. It's called Abstract Triangles from a Simon Says stamp. It's kind of a similar idea with lots of triangles, and you could definitely paint it with this same kind of style without having to do all the masking tape. So I've taken off all the masking tape, and I'm left with 3 patterns of different styles and also different types of watercolor. I'm going to work on the actual greeting that goes on top of each one of these now. I'm using the You Are Loved die set from Simon Says stamp. And just for ease of creating these cards, I'm going to have the same greeting on all 3. I've taken the shadow one and cut it out of vellum. And then I'm using 3 colors of glitter paper from Simon. I've got emerald, black, and copper. And I'm running each one of those through my die cutting machine using the words from that die set. I then grabbed some Gina K Connect glue and added little drops of glue on the back of these die cuts. Just little ones on all the different sections behind the words, and then press that down onto the vellum, kind of wiggling it in place until it was exactly where I wanted it. I also added the hearts from the die cut into the center of the letter O. So I trimmed down each one of these pieces so that I could put it on the front of a 5x7 card base. And I'm now going to be prepping the greetings by putting adhesive on the back. I'm using a Xyron Creative sticker. It's Creative Station. I think it's a Creative Station Light. I think that's the name of it. And what this does is as you roll it through, it puts adhesive all on the back of these die cuts. So it's going to have adhesive just edge to edge on the back of the vellum, and you won't be able to see the adhesive at all once it's down onto my watercolor panels. So I cut that off, and then I'm going to be adhering them directly to my card fronts. Peeling off the front of this sheet here, and now I only have adhesive on the back of the die cuts. So I'll put each one of these on the panels. I use the green on my green pattern, the copper glitter piece on that metallic, and then the black glitter on the very colorful marker watercolor version. I put 3 strips of foam tape on the back of each one of these, and then directly onto the white card bases, which were made out of Neenah Classic Crest Solar White 110-pound cardstock. So here are all 3 cards, all finished. I love the shimmer and shine from the die cut, especially paired with these backgrounds. I love how the patterns turned out, and I hope you are encouraged to try some different types of patterns using narrow strips of masking tape. Thanks for watching today. You can get all the supplies over at Simon Says stamp, and thanks for watching.